Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events, issues, and stories. The story we're analyzing today is the history of this. That's right, we're investigating the history of the Star-Spangled Banner. There are a lot of misconceptions about that song. Most people know it's about a battle. Some even know it's a battle against the British. But a lot of people get the war wrong. They think it's about a battle during the Revolutionary War. But it's not. It's from the War of 1812. So let's do a quick summary of the War of 1812. First of all, it's the worst named war in American history. The name implies that the war all took place in the year 1812. It started in 1812, but it dragged on for 2.5 years. By 1812, the U.S. had been an independent country for about 30 years. The U.S. tried to stay out of foreign entanglements. Essentially, this meant keeping out of European disputes. The problem in the early 1800s was that a military genius named Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered most of Europe. The only reason he couldn't conquer Britain is that it's an island. The English Channel served as a moat which kept Napoleon's Grande Armée at bay. The British had the largest and strongest navy in the world. The U.S. tried to stay neutral in the Napoleonic Wars, but the British would not allow it. There were two main conflicts which led to war between the U.S. and Britain. The first problem stemmed from the British commercial warfare against Napoleonic France. The U.K. created a blockade of all French ports and most of the ports on continental Europe. If American or any other merchants wanted to trade with France, the British demanded that these neutral ships first had to stop in a British port and be searched to make sure that there were not any items that could be of military aid to France. Any commercial ships in the Atlantic which did not first go to Britain would be seized by the British Navy. Since the UK had such an enormous navy, they could actually enforce such a blockade. You can see why the Americans objected to this British policy. The other bone of contention between the US and the UK was the impressment of American sailors. The British needed bodies to man their naval ships. So they would stop American commercial ships in the Atlantic Ocean and theoretically remove British subjects and force them to serve on British naval vessels. First of all, the U.S. did not want to tolerate their merchant ships being stopped and boarded and having men forcibly dragged off of their boats, even if those guys were really British subjects. Second, a lot of the men that were kidnapped by the British Navy were American-born. You had the Royal Navy kidnapping Americans off of American boats and forced to serve in the British Navy. No self-respecting country could tolerate either of these issues. So, after several years of conflict over the blockade and impressment, the U.S. declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. By the way, this was the first time that the United States declared war against another nation. America was not prepared for war, to say the least. At the time war was declared, the American Army had only approximately 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers, and these were not experienced men. To compound this, there were not many experienced officers to train the existing army, as well as all of the new recruits, as the American government tried to expand the military. Congress authorized a 35,000-man army in 1812. Those few officers and non-commissioned officers with any fighting experience were put in charge of the new recruits. By the way, fighting experience in those days meant fighting on the frontier against the Native Americans. In contrast, the British had tens of thousands of soldiers. The British had been fighting Napoleon for years, and their army was made up of battle-hardened veterans. The disparities in the navies were even worse. When war was declared in the summer of 1812, the British Navy had hundreds of warships, which were mostly ships of the line and frigates. Ships of the line were the largest fighting ships of those days. Essentially, the equivalent of battleships in the days of wooden ships powered by wind and sail. They could do a tremendous amount of damage. A frigate was a warship one step down from a ship of the line, but the main difference was that a frigate would have one gun deck and a ship of the line would have 2 or 3 gun decks, which meant a lot more guns. This was at a time when navies still would maneuver their ships to fire broadsides. This meant that they would position the ship so that the side of the ship was facing the target, bringing half of the ship's guns to bear at any given time. And what did the U.S. have to combat the largest navy in the world? America had no ships of the line and less than 10 frigates. I found conflicting numbers about the exact figures. The U.S. also had some small ships, which were sloops and brigs. Although the Americans started building additional ships, things did not look good for the American side. Surprisingly, the American Navy held its own against the much larger Royal Navy. I'm not going to go through details of battles or military campaigns, but I will highlight a few aspects of the war. In the spring of 1813, American Oliver Hazard Perry was sent to Lake Erie to try to take control of that lake back from the British. The Americans built a fleet on Lake Erie from scratch. On September 10, 1813, the American fleet, commanded by Oliver Hazard Perry, defeated the British squadron and took control of Lake Erie. The reason I bring up this battle is because Perry is famous for one of the most celebrated sayings in American history, and certainly one of my favorites. After defeating the British fleet on Lake Erie, Perry sent a message to Major General William Henry Harrison that read, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." That is such a great line. By the way, if that name William Henry Harrison sounds familiar, he later became our 9th president. He's mostly famous for dying 1 month after he was inaugurated as president in 1841. Essentially, his presidency is limited to being a trivia question. In the early 1800s, Canada was a series of British colonies. The Americans tried to conquer Canada to add it to the United States, but that did not go very well. As Americans, we always assumed that everybody would like to join our club if they could. The American armies that invaded Canada presumed that they would be welcomed as liberators, freeing the local Canadians from the British Empire. Much to the surprise of the U.S. soldiers, the Canadians did not rally to the American flag, and the British Army was able to drive back the invaders. The war dragged on for a couple of years. Things heated up in the summer of 1814 because Napoleon had finally been beaten by the UK and its allies. This freed up the British military, and now they could devote their attention to fighting the US. In August 1814, the British landed troops in Maryland and marched on to Washington, D.C. They easily defeated the American troops that were trying to protect the capital at the Battle of Bladensburg. On August 24, 1814, the British Army proceeded into Washington and burned the Capitol building, the White House, and several other government buildings. The only bright spot from that horrible affair was Dolly Madison, the First Lady. President James Madison was not in Washington at the time. As Dolly Madison was trying to save as many things from the White House as she could, she remembered the famous portrait of George Washington, which had been painted by Gilbert Stuart. The frame around the painting was screwed into the walls. Time was of the essence, so Dolly had some of the White House servants destroy the frame with blunt objects. The painting was then rolled up and taken away just before the British arrived. The reason this is such a cool event is that America was a young country at the time. We did not have many sacred relics. This painting of George Washington was one of those relics, and Dolly Madison made sure that the British didn't burn it. After they burned down Washington, D.C., the next target for the British was Baltimore. You might not think of Baltimore as a large city, but in 1814, it was the 3rd largest city in America after New York and Philadelphia. Baltimore is located where the Patapsco River goes into Chesapeake Bay. The center of the city is located around an area they call the Inner Harbor. Guarding the entrance to the part of the Patapsco River which leads to the inner harbor in downtown Baltimore, is Fort McHenry. The British plan was to bombard Fort McHenry with superior naval firepower and, after capturing the fort, march into Baltimore. You have to realize that this wasn't just about national pride. If you were a citizen of Baltimore in 1814 and the British came in and burned down the city, you lost everything. There was no insurance on your house. You would be homeless. You would have nothing to eat. All of your possessions would be gone, and probably your means of making a living would also be gone. If the British sacked Baltimore, this would be a complete catastrophe for America's third largest city. We'll come back to the attack on Fort McHenry in a moment, but first, let's introduce the central character of our story, Francis Scott Key. There are some people in history that are always listed by three names. I have no idea why that is, but Francis Scott Key is one of those people. You never hear of him just referred to as Francis Key. So, who was Mr. Key? He was a local guy, born in Maryland on August 1, 1779, so he was 35 years old when the British attacked Fort McHenry. He was a prominent lawyer in Frederick, Maryland, and in Washington, D.C. He briefly served in the War of 1812 as a quartermaster. That's a military officer who deals with logistics like quarters for the soldiers, rations, clothing, and other supplies. Unfortunately, Francis Scott Key owned slaves. Yes, he owned other human beings. How anybody could purportedly say that by law of nature, all men are free, and yet purchase people as if they were chattel is beyond me. Anyway, back to our story. In early September 1814, Francis Scott Key and the American agent for prisoners of war, Colonel John Skinner, went by boat out to the HMS Tonnant, a British naval vessel. That ship was part of the British fleet, which was located in the Chesapeake Bay and preparing to attack Baltimore. Key and Skinner were there to petition for the release of Dr. William Beans, who was a friend of Francis Scott Key. Dr. Beans was an American from Maryland who had been captured by the British. Key brought with him some letters from British soldiers who had been treated by Dr. Beans. The British released Dr. Beans to Key and Skinner. All three men were allowed to return to their ship, but their ship had to stay out in the bay, surrounded by the British warships. The reason for this is that these three Americans had now seen the size and location of the British fleet. The three Americans would have to remain on their own ship until they were told they could go home. A week later, the British started bombarding Fort McHenry. The shelling of the fort continued from the morning of September 13th through the morning of the 14th. Francis Scott Key anxiously watched the cannon fire into the American fort. Throughout the night, he could only get glimpses of what was going on, as he would later describe being able to see by the rockets' red glare and bombs bursting in the air. The only way to tell that the Americans were not defeated was when Key could see the American flag was still flying over Fort McHenry. On the morning of September 14th, the British stopped bombing the fort with their naval cannons. Francis Scott Key could see the American flag was still flying over Fort McHenry by the dawn's early light. The Americans had withstood shelling for approximately 25 hours. Without subduing the fort, the British did not believe that they could successfully attack Baltimore, so the British fleet sailed away. Key and the other Americans were allowed to return to Baltimore. While still on his ship outside of Baltimore, on the morning of September 14th, Key started writing a poem about seeing the American flag still flying over Fort McHenry. When he got back to Baltimore, he finished the poem titled Defense of Fort McHenry. The words of the poem were added to an existing tune called Anacreon in Heaven. That is the tune we now know today as the national anthem. The poem, now song, was soon published in newspapers in Baltimore and then throughout the United States under the new title, the Star-Spangled Banner. Over the next 117 years, the Star-Spangled Banner gained in popularity. It was regularly played by the American Army and Navy, as well as played by civilian bands at many patriotic events. But it was not until March 3, 1931, when President Herbert Hoover signed a bill passed by Congress, that the Star-Spangled Banner was officially designated as our national anthem. As I told you, Baltimore was saved in August 1814. What happened with the remainder of the war? On December 24, 1814, American and British representatives signed the Treaty of Ghent. Sorry, but I got to take a little detour here. When people refer to that treaty, they always say that it was signed in Ghent, Belgium. Not true. Belgium didn't exist in those days. The country of Belgium wouldn't exist for another 16 years. The area that is now Belgium belonged to different countries over the years. When the American and British representatives were negotiating to end their war in 1814, the city of Ghent was still part of France because the French had annexed this area during the Napoleonic Wars. I know what you're thinking. Why would the British be in France, their arch enemy? It's because the Allied coalition, which included the United Kingdom, had invaded France and captured Paris, and Napoleon surrendered in the spring of 1814. And for those of you who are thinking, wait a minute, didn't Napoleon make a comeback? Yes, he did. In 1815, he escaped from the island of Elba and returned to France and raised a new army. But he was finally defeated once and for all at the Battle of Waterloo, which is only about 50 miles southeast of Ghent. After the final defeat of Napoleon at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the area that is now known as Belgium was declared part of the Netherlands. In 1830, Belgium finally became an independent country when it broke away from the Netherlands. Sorry, I could not resist that little detour in our story, but it bugs me when people refer to the Treaty of Ghent as taking place in Belgium. Now you know the kind of things that keep us history geeks up in the middle of the night. Anyway, the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war, but the fighting did not end for another month. It took about 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic in 1814. The news of the signed treaty did not reach North America until January 1815. As a result, one of the most famous battles of the war occurred after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed. On January 8, 1815, a British army tried to capture New Orleans. The city was defended by an American army commanded by Andrew Jackson. Even though the British had a large advantage in the number of troops, it was a very decisive victory for the Americans. The U.S. suffered somewhere around 60 to 70 casualties, while the British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including the death of the British commanding general. By the way, the term casualties means both killed as well as wounded. This battle made Andrew Jackson a celebrity throughout the United States and was one of the causes that led him to being elected as our 7th president in 1828. So, what was the outcome of the War of 1812? Essentially, it was a stalemate. Very little was different in 1815 than it was before the war started in the summer of 1812. But although the U.S. did not win the war, it gained a lot of international prestige for being able to go toe-to-toe with the mighty British Empire. What about the actual Star-Spangled Banner? What happened to the flag that Francis Scott Key saw flying over Fort McHenry? Well, we're not exactly sure which flag was flying over Fort McHenry during the British bombardment. In the summer of 1814, the commander of the fort, Major George Armistead, ordered a flag so large that the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance. A woman in Baltimore named Mary Pickersgill was hired to sew the gigantic flag. She was assisted by several family members. When completed, the flag was 30 feet from top to bottom and 42 feet across. That is huge! But, as was the custom of the time, a second smaller flag was also sewn. The smaller flag measured 17 feet by 25 feet. The larger flag was known by the common term of the day as the garrison flag. The smaller flag was known as the storm flag. The idea was the smaller flag would be flown during bad weather. There's a little controversy as to which flag was flying during the night when Fort McHenry was being bombed by the British. Historians disagree and were not certain, but it appears that the smaller storm flag flew throughout the night during the rainstorm and the heavy bombardment by the Royal Navy. But most historians believe that in the morning, the larger garrison flag was raised, and that is the flag which was flying when Francis Scott Key saw by the dawn's early light the American flag flying over Fort McHenry, signifying the defiance that the Americans were still in control of the fort. So it's that larger garrison flag which is considered the Star-Spangled Banner, which inspired Francis Scott Key. Major George Armistead remained in command of Fort McHenry for the rest of his life. That sounds dramatic, but unfortunately, he died only 3 years later at the age of 38. Apparently, he died of natural causes, but it's unknown exactly what. In the 1800s, people just died and doctors didn't know why. Somehow, the larger of the two flags, which is now usually referred to as the Star-Spangled Banner, ended up with the Armistead family. Over the years, pieces were cut from the flag and given to people as souvenirs. Fortunately, the Armistead family gave the flag to the Smithsonian Institution in the early 1900s. It has since been repaired and preserved. That flag is now in the Smithsonian Institution. We don't know what happened to the smaller flag, which many historians believe flew over the fort during the night while it was raining and the bombs were flying. That flag is completely lost to history. Now, if you see photos of the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag which flew over Fort McHenry during the morning and inspired Francis Scott Key, you will notice something odd. The flag has 15 stars and also has 15 stripes. This was the only time in American history when our national flag had more than 13 stripes. Okay, time for a little background. We celebrate Flag Day on June 14th every year because on June 14, 1777, the Flag Act of 1777 was passed by the Continental Congress. Here is the full text of that act. Resolved that the flag of the 13 United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation. That is the complete language. Now, this broad definition of the flag led to a lot of variations. For one thing, the law did not state whether there would be 7 red and 6 white stripes or 7 white and 6 red stripes. This resulted in flags depicted both ways, some with the majority of red and some with the majority of white stripes. By the way, we now have a majority of red. Also, there was no definition about how the 13 stars were to be placed in the blue field. Some people made flags with the stars shaped in a pattern which made one large star. Some put the stars in rows. Some put the stars in a circle. And there was still a question, what type of stars? 5-pointed stars? 6-pointed stars? There were a lot of ambiguities and a lot of variations of the American flag. The most famous example is the flag known as the Betsy Ross flag, which had 7 red stripes and 6 white stripes and 13 stars in a circle. And those stars had 5 points. We all grew up learning that Betsy Ross designed the original American flag. Unfortunately, it's not true. The flag I just described is commonly called the Betsy Ross flag. It was named after a woman from Philadelphia who sewed uniforms, tents, and flags for the Continental Army during the Revolution. It's true that she sewed flags. Unfortunately for Betsy Ross, before 1870, there's no known evidence that she designed the most common variation of the flag with the 13 5-pointed stars arranged in a circle in a blue field in the upper left-hand corner with 7 red and 6 white stripes. In 1870, essentially a century after the Revolution, a man named William Canby told the Historical Society of Philadelphia that his grandmother, Betsy Ross, created the first flag of the United States. William Canby did not have any proof of this claim. He made this assertion based totally on family legends told to him decades after Betsy Ross's death. Regrettably, we don't know who really designed the original American flag. The Betsy Ross story is probably just a nice myth which gained popularity from her descendants. Okay, back to the history of the flag. As I told you earlier, the general parameters of the flag were set forth in the Flag Act of 1777 by the Continental Congress. In 1794, a new Flag Act was passed and signed by President George Washington. The design of the flag was changed because there were now 15 states. Vermont and Kentucky had become the 14th and 15th states. The Flag Act of 1794 stated that there would now be 15 alternating red and white stripes and 15 stars in the blue field. This is the flag design that was flying over Fort McHenry and now known as the Star-Spangled Banner. The strange thing was that by the time of the Battle of Baltimore, Tennessee, Ohio, and Louisiana had also joined the Union. This meant that by August 1814, there were 18 states. Yet the famous Star-Spangled Banner over Fort McHenry had 15 stars and 15 stripes. This problem of the wrong number of stars would be remedied with the Flag Act of 1818. That law provided for the modern rule of having 13 red and white stripes representing the 13 original states. The stars would match the number of states. Every time a new state joined the Union, a star was added to the flag on the following 4th of July. Starting on July 4, 1912, the American flag had 48 stars. That's the flag that you see in World War II movies. The last two states, Alaska and Hawaii, both joined in 1959. However, Alaska was admitted before Independence Day on January 3, 1959, and Hawaii was not admitted until after Independence Day on August 21, 1959. This meant that a star was added on July 4, 1959, representing Alaska, but the 50th star was not added until July 4, 1960, representing Hawaii. So, for 1 year, from July 1959 until July 1960, we had a 49-star flag. They're pretty rare, but they are out there. Those flags had 7 rows of 7 stars, but they were not in orderly columns. The even number rows were a little indented compared to the odd number rows. The 48-star flag was in effect for 47 years. However, the present 50-star flag has existed since July 4, 1960. The current format has existed for over 62 years, making it the longest used version of the U.S. flag. Remember earlier when I said that the exact layout of the flag was ambiguous in the 1700s, which led to various designs? We don't have that problem anymore. The exact layout is specified by an executive order from President Dwight Eisenhower in August 1959 and incorporated into 4 United States Code Sections 1 and 2. Most Americans associate the Star-Spangled Banner with the beginning of sporting events. Think about it. When was the last time you heard the Star-Spangled Banner and it wasn't at a football, baseball, or basketball game? How did this ever get started? There are reported instances of the Star-Spangled Banner being played at isolated baseball games from the Civil War through the turn of the century. But national attention was first given to the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner at baseball games because of World War I. In the 1918 World Series, the Star-Spangled Banner was played during the 7th inning stretch of Game 2 at Wrigley Field in Chicago. The crowd was very exuberant. This was during the last year of World War I. America and its allies were clearly about to win the war, and people were feeling particularly patriotic. Because of the enthusiastic reception from the crowd, the Star-Spangled Banner was played at each of the remaining games of the 1918 World Series. When the World Series moved to Boston, they began playing the Star-Spangled Banner before the game instead of during the 7th inning stretch. But playing the national anthem at baseball games did not become a regular part of baseball after the World Series ended. World War I ended in November of 1918, and patriotic fervor died down. But when World War II came about, the Star-Spangled Banner became a regular part of sporting events. As I explained earlier, the Star-Spangled Banner had become the official national anthem in 1931. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States was very unified and most people were feeling very patriotic. Major League Baseball started playing the national anthem before games. After the war, the tradition caught on with the NFL as well as the NHL, and then with the new National Basketball Association. Let's finish up today with the Key family. Francis Scott Key died on January 11, 1843 at his home in Baltimore. We believe he died of pleurisy. He was 63 years old. But here's an interesting story about Francis Scott Key's son, Philip Barton Key, and a man named Daniel Sickles. First, let's explain who these two men were. In the late 1850s, Daniel Sickles was a congressman from New York City. In the Civil War, he served as a general in the Union Army and lost a leg at Gettysburg. Philip Barton Key, besides being the son of Francis Scott Key, was famous in his own right as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, a prestigious position. What linked these two men together was when, on February 27, 1859, Congressman Daniel Sickles made national headlines when he murdered Philip Barton Key. Why did he do it? Well, it's because Philip was having an affair with the wife of Dan Sickles, Teresa. Sickles shot Key 3 times in the middle of Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. That's the square directly across from the main entrance to the White House. Sickles immediately surrendered and admitted his guilt. His case made legal history because it was the first successful use of the defense of temporary insanity in the United States. And who was the lead attorney representing Daniel Sickles? Edwin Stanton, who later served as the Secretary of War during the Civil War. So, even though Sickles admitted that he shot Philip Barton Key, who was unarmed, by the way, Sickles was acquitted on the defense of temporary insanity. And here's the kicker. After the trial, Dan Sickles and Teresa got back together. But Teresa died in 1867 of tuberculosis, and Daniel remarried a few years later. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Ratings and likes greatly help with the algorithms on these podcast apps. So if you're listening on a podcast app like Apple Podcasts or Spotify that allow for ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Please tell your coworkers, relatives, friends. Word of mouth is the best way to increase my audience. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you'll find links to my podcast episodes as well as fun items for history geeks like This Date in History, book recommendations, historical sound bites, photos of some of the subjects of certain episodes, and links to some supporting historical evidence. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.